All right. Well, I think I'll kick us off. So if you don't know me, my name is Ingmar Gorman. I'm a psychologist and also co-founder of Fluence. We are a psychedelic education and training company. You probably know about us, but if not, you can find us at fluencetraining.com. And you are joining us today for one of our webinars. We do this on a monthly basis. It's an opportunity for us and our community to connect to people in the field from various backgrounds. Yeah, we're looking to just share information, to learn, and to connect. The agenda for today, we'll have about a 45-minute conversation. We will try to stick to 45 minutes. The guest today and I know can just chat on and on and on and on. So I'm really hoping that this is going to be, I feel very confident this is going to be a really exciting and engaging conversation. The last 15 minutes of today we'll dedicate to Q&A and discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, I'd really would ask you to find the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and submit your questions there. It's just really helpful because it allows us to see all the questions in one place. If it goes into the chat, if you submit your question in the chat by typing, the chat moves up and it's sometimes really, really hard to track, and we can lose sight of a question that we might really want to engage with. So for today, I have the pleasure of introducing Jules Evans. I actually did not ask for your bio, so I will ask Jules to say a little bit about himself. But I just wanted to share a little bit about how I connected with Jules. I actually can't remember how I first learned of his Substack, but somehow I was receiving updates. It's named Ecstatic Integration, so the name itself immediately was sort of, oh, well, this is alluring to me. And the experience that I had with it is, as somebody who is running a company and leading trainings, there's so much that I would like to write about. There's so many things I would like to do that I just don't have the time for. And as one practices as a psychedelic therapist, as an integrationist, as one is thinking about these ideas, all sorts of lessons come to mind as one is doing doing this work. But because there isn't enough time to really write articles about every one of these subjects, it just sort of comes up for me and then it just goes into the back burner. And what I found with Jules' Substack is consistently, every single time a new piece came out, I thought, this is an idea that I had thought that somebody should be talking about, and nobody's talking about it. And here's this person who's consistently writing about these, what I think of as sort of underrepresented, or maybe avoided, or maybe not thought of kind of lessons or ideas. And I had a wonderful conversation with Jules on the phone about a month or two ago. And this webinar is a logical extension of this. So maybe without further ado, I'd love to invite you, Jules, to the screen. Love to hear a little bit about yourself. And maybe as a sort of primer into the first question, how did you find yourself writing a Substack about psychedelics?
Thanks for having me, Ingmar. I really just want to say that I really respect your work and what you've built at Fluence with Elizabeth Nielsen as well. And your paper on psychedelic integration and harm reduction has been a big influence on our work as well. So thank you for having me and for your kind words about the Substack. So the kind of quick version is I was intensely into psychedelics as a teenager in the 90s, as were my friends. We had lots of good experiences, but I had a negative psychedelic experience when I was 18, which I didn't integrate very well at all. And that led me to developing social anxiety and PTSD for about 6 years. Had very little access to information about what to do, went to a therapist and they were no help at all. So eventually found my way to cognitive behavioral therapy, and that helped me. And I started, and I noticed its similarity to Stoic philosophy. So eventually led to my first book, which was about Stoic philosophy and how it influenced CBT and how people use it today. But I was also still interested in ecstatic experiences, including psychedelic experiences. So my second book was called The Art of Losing Control. That was about how we can find ecstatic experiences. When are they good for us? When are they bad for us? And in 2021, in the peak of the shroom boom, I was fascinated by the new research on the benefits of psychedelics. But I also had this feeling, what about the harms that psychedelics can sometimes cause? Where's the research on the harms, and where's the research on what helps people if they get into difficulties? So I thought, well, I can try and do that myself. By that stage, I was working in academia in the UK in medical humanities, the kind of philosophy and history of well-being, flourishing, and so on. So I helped to put together a team called the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, an interdisciplinary team, but mainly psychologists working in the UK and also therapists, journalists, and so on. And we are particularly interested in what kind of difficulties people sometimes experience after taking psychedelics, and what helps them cope with those difficulties. We want to see better research, better communication, and better support for people for those who get into difficulties after taking psychedelics, or to avoid those difficulties altogether. And as part of that, we have this Substack, Ecstatic Integration. So we mainly produce academic research, but I also, I was a journalist for 15 years, and I love, digging into some of these, questions you mentioned. So we've done articles on all kinds of things like negative entity encounters on psychedelics, or when people have visions of childhood abuse on psychedelics and wonder if it's true. Some of the weird kinds of adverse experiences people can have. We get people contacting us who tell us their stories, whether that be insomnia or derealization. And then we're always trying to be practical and ask, and what helped you, if anything? So yeah, that's our project.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, such an alignment on that project between our audience and the harm reduction integration approach, and just completely concur that we need more and more research to understand both the possible harms and then also how do people get better. So yeah, we're in definite agreement there. So I was wondering whether you might be able to share, you mentioned some of the kind of adverse events that you've encountered, but is there anything more that you could share about maybe taking that first part, that first half, what kinds of difficult experiences do people report?
Yeah. So about 50% of people who take psychedelics will have one or more so-called challenging experience. I have met people who've said they've taken psychedelics hundreds of times and never had a challenging experience, but there are others who say whenever they take psychedelics, they have a kind of gnarly, challenging experience. And people say that those can be one of the worst and most terrifying experiences of their lives. Now, most still appreciate them, but not all. So somewhere between 15 and 50% of people say they felt that no real good came from those challenging experiences. And sometimes psychedelics lead to difficulties that last beyond the trip itself. How often? Well, we didn't look at that in our research, but in one paper, 9% of people who took psilocybin in naturalistic settings said it led to functional difficulties lasting longer than a day. In another survey, it was 23% of people said it led to difficulties lasting longer than a day. And in clinical trials as well, sometimes participants in clinical trials can have difficulties lasting beyond the experience themselves. What makes it more likely that people experience difficulties after the trip? Things like adverse setting, prior psychological difficulties, taking a high dose, being young. So in terms of adverse settings, we know that psychedelics are context amplifiers. So if you're in an adverse setting, it amplifies that. We had people in our research, one person took a high dose of LSD and then accidentally locked himself out of his house And it happened to be during the Great Storm of 1987 in the UK. So he was there, you know, in kind of a hurricane. I think also in our research, we got quite a few stories of people who take psychedelics on their own and then get stuck in kind of very negative thinking and don't really have people there to help bring them out of that kind of doom loop. We also, even clinical trials can be adverse settings. I recently interviewed a participant in a trial by Braxia for psilocybin for depression. And the trial took place in this tiny windowless room in a strip mall, and the support wasn't very empathetic. The psychiatrist said, "We're not here to guide you, we're just here to keep you safe." And this participant put out her hand for support and no one took her hand. And this was quite traumatic for her. And she says it led to difficulties which lasted 2 years later. So if that can lead to kind of extended difficulties, imagine like an abusive therapist or healer and how much harm that could do. So during the experience, a certain mindset as well can make it more likely that you'll experience difficulties that will last beyond the trip. For example, like catastrophizing, thinking that I've done it, I've broken myself forever, or thinking this will never end, I'm stuck in this experience forever, or thinking like everyone else is talking about me, that kind of paranoia. So those kinds of strong beliefs can carry on beyond the trip itself. Okay, so what sorts of extended difficulties do we find in our research? We did a survey last year and we asked, have you ever had difficulties lasting longer than a day after a psychedelic experience? If so, what kind of difficulties and what helped? So we got over 600 responses. They were all people who said, yes, I've experienced difficulties after psychedelics. 1/3 said their difficulties lasted longer than a year, and 1/5 said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years. The 6 most common were firstly anxiety and fear, which can include like feeling traumatized by the experience, fear of going mad, fear of the experience repeating, and various other kinds of fear and phobia. Secondly, derealization and depersonalization. So for example, this is an email I just got yesterday from someone. I had my session of psychedelics with a trained facilitator. The first half felt great. During the second half, I had the strong realization that everything only exists in my perception, and I cannot be too sure about the existence of anything. Even the past felt unreal. I felt very dissociated from everything. Even the facilitators felt they weren't existing. Today, this feeling didn't leave me yet. I felt like I can't know that anything is real and actually exists. I'm so sad. I would appreciate any words of comfort or help to get out of this situation. So it's rare, but people do report these kinds of derealization and depersonalization experiences. Do you remember the pilot? He wasn't
Yes.
flying the plane, but he was unfortunately in the cockpit 2 days after he took mushrooms, and he thought, I'm in a dream. How do I wake up? And he tried to crash the plane. So those kinds of derealization experiences can happen, and they can last days, weeks, months, or years. And we're just beginning to learn about what helps people mitigate those symptoms. Third, social disconnection. As that person said, he feels a sense of detachment from other people. Fourth, existential confusion. We're doing a study on this now. People reporting kind of ontological shock and existential confusion after a powerful psychedelic experience. Here's one quote from that study. Most days I would feel anxiety, fear, disorientation, and deeply saddened by my existence, which progressed into existential crisis. The questioning of this whole universe. Why are we here? What's the point of this? I think that kind of ontological shock can be particularly acute if you have, entity encounters. So I spoke to someone this week, a veteran who went to an ayahuasca retreat, and suddenly they're plunged into the world of Amazon shamanism, and they come back to the US and they're bewildered. What was that? It's completely different to their worldview, and they're still experiencing some kind of ontological shock from that.
And it kind of feels, if I can just
Yes,
interject,
sorry, yeah.
it kind of feels like there's almost like a Venn diagram, or there's sort of over there the phenomena that you're describing can be either distinct or overlapping. You know, there's sort of
That's
there's
true.
almost dissociation that you're describing may come with that ontological shock, or may or you might just get the ontological shock perhaps without the sort of
I
depersonalization or derealization.
I agree, and I wish it was more discreet. From a treatment point of view, it'd be a lot easier if there was this, or this. But actually, sometimes people with continued visual distortions also feel derealization. Some people with anxiety also feel, so you get clusters of symptoms. And that can make it, harder to treat. But sometimes similar sorts of practices or interventions seem to help people. But I think the points I would just make is that psychedelics can lead to these kinds of extended difficulties beyond experiences lasting weeks, months, years, or decades. That can sometimes happen in clinical trials and safe settings, but adverse settings makes it more likely. Some view them as still as part of a healing process ultimately, but not everyone. And they're pretty unpredictable. So they can lead to quite unusual symptoms. We get people who've emailed us, they took mushrooms and they have severe insomnia for like weeks afterwards. I interviewed someone who had permanent kind of physical and sexual arousal after taking part in a trial in a very disturbing way for them. People get apophenia, like changing how so it's just quite unpredictable how these substances affect the mind and the nervous system.
Um, well, maybe to take a slight tangent, I do think we should definitely not miss out on the question of when you spoke to these individuals, what are some of the findings in terms of what they found to be helpful? Because I'm sure that our audience really wants to know, well,
Yeah,
what can I do in these situations? But perhaps before we get to that, to go on a slight tangent, I'm guessing that you saw the New York Times article that came out recently about the Nova terrorist attack.
yeah, I
And
did.
so there's a group of researchers in Israel who um, have been surveying, interviewing participants at that music festival who, if I'm recalling correctly, approximately 50% of the interviewees were on either psychedelics, MDMA, ketamine, what they identified as light drugs, cannabis, alcohol, stimulants. And of course, not at all to make any kind of lightness out of a tragic event.
Yeah,
Um, but to say that I don't know of any kind of similar event where so many people would be on psychedelics, where there was
yeah.
such a adverse uh, at
Set
uh,
context.
context. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes. And so, what made me think about that was just how you mentioned that the kinds of experiences that people have and the outcomes when, say, they're in therapy and there's say a abusive therapist or shaman or who what have you, and
mm,
there probably is something there that has to do with the trust between the two people, the trust being violated. I don't want to compare one to the other, but just to say that I would say I had a bias. My bias was thinking that what could be more nightmarish than experiencing that kind of a terrorist attack while on psychedelic. And
yeah,
again, there's a bias towards survivorship, and the study I think is just in preprint. I really would like it to get peer reviewed and for us to really kind of get a little bit that honed in. But my point being that at least some of my priors were questioned about that when I was reading some of the kind of firsthand accounts of the participants at the festival, who were saying that they felt kind of that I believe one person said that they were able to sort of pick up their partner, their girlfriend, and sort of run away to safety, that they felt a sense of maybe adrenaline that combined with the psychedelic that gave them some sort of sense of power to be able to do something. And the evidence, and I still think that it needs to go through proper peer review, but the paper that's in preprint that's available online is saying that individuals who were on MDMA seem to experience fewer adverse reactions than
Yeah,
non-substance users or other um,
yeah.
people on other drugs. Again, I think really needs to be qualified that this needs to go through peer review, but it goes against my presuppositions about how people would respond to that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think I was also reading it this morning, and I think it made me think two things. The first thing is I wondered, I asked the authors, what are the applications of this study? Because, people are beginning to experiment with the use of psychedelics for soldiers, serving soldiers, to reduce combat fatigue and that kind of thing. And generals reading this going, oh wow, look, they were able to work better under traumatic situations and come away not traumatized. Do we need to be microdosing our soldiers with MDMA? So that's one thing I was curious about. The other thing is, of course, it doesn't talk about the context afterwards as well.
Mm.
Those participants would have had a huge amount of support and sympathy from their society, from their families, and from probably people that we both know as well who volunteered their time to work with these people. That's not always the case when people have adverse experiences in psychedelic culture. They might feel less able to talk about it. If they're going to, just on their own in a clinical trial, they're going back to a context where they're not feeling necessarily so supported, by their entire society. On the contrary, that we're still in a culture where psychedelics aren't really understood. They aren't known well. They're not widely kind of appreciated. So that's potentially can make
Oh,
maybe difficulties more likely because you're feeling that social disconnection.
Jules, I think that's such an incredibly important point. I completely agree that context afterwards matters so much. And maybe that's a good segue to the next
Mm.
part of the question, which is when you spoke to people or you've done this research, what do people who've experienced adverse events or outcomes, what have they said was helpful for them?
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is there's a whole lot of research to be done. Um, so if anyone's out there like thinking about things to research, there's so many topics where there haven't been any papers. Like there's been no paper on post-psychedelic trauma and what helps people deal with it. There's no paper on post-psychedelic derealization and what helps people deal with it. So this is a rich whole area for research. So and that's actually, but that's also scary for people because we get emails from people like this person who emailed me yesterday saying, what do? I can't sleep, or I'm getting this massive nervous dysregulation, or whatever their symptoms are. Who do I turn to for help? And there aren't yet many obvious places. There's not much evidence-based research. So I just think there's some work to be done on that for all of us, really. We asked people in our survey what helped. Now, this was just a first step, Ingmar. So as you can imagine, basically people could tell us all their difficulties and all the things that help them with those difficulties. So it's not, it's we people were listing sometimes 5 different types of difficulties and 5 different types of coping mechanisms. What we're now doing is we're trying to find what kinds of difficulties last longest, and just we're asking people name the top 3 kinds of coping methods that you used for that to try and be more granular. But the most common types of coping mechanisms that people said was, first of all, social support, a friend or family member. Remember that most people, they're not going to go to a therapist or a psychiatrist. These are difficulties, but they're not such severe difficulties that they're checking into a hospital. It's more just like a persistent feeling of disease, unwell, disturbance. So people are speaking to friends and family. Often their friends will be more familiar with psychedelics than if they went to a therapist or a psychiatrist.
Mhm.
So that just helps them to normalize the problem, to socialize it, just receive kind of love and empathy. Some also said they went to a therapist, some to a spiritual guide, a few said psychiatrists. one interesting point is that as many in the survey said that social support, when they sought it, was unhelpful, as said it was helpful. Why was that? Now, that might be that their friends or family or the therapist or psychiatrist didn't have any understanding of psychedelics, wasn't familiar with them. I went to a therapist when I was 20 and they said, this sounds just like teenage angst. I'm sure you'll grow out of it. They were completely unfamiliar with psychedelics. A psychiatrist could be over pathologizing, just say, well, this sounds like mania, or it sounds like you've broken your brain. It sounds like you have a disorder requiring medication for the rest of your life. But if you go to a psychedelic integration coach or to a kind of psychedelic guide or neo-shaman, some people said they felt the response was too spiritual. Like, oh, this is the medicine knows what you need. This is part of the process. This is part of your spiritual awakening. Now, some people find that helpful, but some people didn't appreciate that. So it's really about trying not to impose your frame onto your client or patient, rather to kind of listen to them. What's the problem? What might help cope, with those problems? And then people also mentioned self-care practices. Again, most people can't afford to go to a therapist, and they're a bit wary of going to a psychiatrist maybe. So people are practicing some of the same kinds of self-care methods that people use to integrate positive trips as well. Meditation, exercise, yoga, cognitive distancing, learning to, I am not this symptom, I'm experiencing it, I can observe it. Grounding exercises seem to be very important, especially for dissociation and existential confusion, people feeling like, not fully here. So just grounding back in their body and in this mundane reality, grounding back in their relationships seems to be helpful for people. And then kind of meaning making, maybe not in the acute crisis, but in the kind of months afterwards, finding information, finding the handful of books that talk about, difficulties after psychedelics, whether that's like Stan Grof, Mark Aischler wrote a very good book, and others. Mm-hmm. Finding similar stories. A lot of people say it was very therapeutic for them to find other people's stories of having gone through extended difficulties. And sometimes coming to new worldviews after months. And then some people also find medication helpful. And a few say what really helped after like months or years was re-entering an altered state, either through something like breath work or sometimes through another psychedelic experience, and feeling like they managed to kind of hold their ground and process it. But I would warn people, like, they would only do that when they're in a different place, as it were, much more resourced. Do it when you're in a very, in free fall, it's probably just going to re-traumatize you and make it worse.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And one thing that again, just the word that comes to my mind is nuance. And I feel like just we need more nuance globally. And I really appreciate you sort of being that nuanced voice. And some things that came to my mind as you were speaking around what could be helpful or what people have encountered. For example, that idea of the unfolding process, or this answer. Well, the experiences that you're feeling right now, they're just uncomfortable. They're part of the process. And I think the nuance that needs to come into that response is that the person is not just left hanging, and that necessarily ends there. That a clinician or a friend or somebody can say, okay, this is sometimes something that occurs. And of course, I think a differential diagnosis is important to recognize, okay, how severe is this? How do we intervene? But also, like, okay, so this is part of the process, but how can I help you? How can we work together to, in light of the fact that this is something that you're experiencing, which is uncomfortable? There's a similar, you mentioned that Braxia piece earlier, where the person said, I'm not here to guide you. I'm here to make sure that you're safe. And I can hear an echo of psychedelic training, which is that what we try to do is inform therapists that they're not the guide, in the sense that they're not the expert who's directive, who's telling the person what they need to realize or where they need to go, but sort of the other edge is that, well, I'm not here to guide you, therefore you're sort of on your own here, or I'm limited in I'm not going to support you perhaps in the way that you need it. So how we
Yeah,
train, how we teach, there's always sort of this balance around, okay, what are we communicating, but also not taking it too far.
right. And I think, clients will pick up on the use of kind of loaded terms like the medicine or mama ayahuasca or the mushroom, and that those are kind of dogmatic terms. I mean, it's complicated, and there's a whole debate about this, about what you call these kinds of things. Do you call them adverse experiences? But for some people, they don't see them as just adverse. Adverse means detrimental and
Mm.
harmful. And for some, I interviewed someone in the Compass trial who
Hmm.
felt more suicidal after the trial, and didn't, felt that she was at risk of committing suicide, but luckily she got very good, intense support afterwards. But she feels in a better place now to some extent than she did before the trial. But so she doesn't feel that what she went through was adverse. It was
Mm.
just kind of gnarly and challenging and overwhelming and risky. It exposed certain issues in her.
Yeah.
But then others kind of develop new symptoms like tinnitus or extended derealization or insomnia. And if you say to someone, what's medicine trying to tell you with tinnitus? Well, it's kind of a new symptom. And there's a great psychiatrist in Berlin, Tomislav Majic,
Hmm.
and he said to me, maybe there are occasions when integration isn't the right word, because integration implies kind of like listening to the experience, taking the benefits from it. But sometimes there are kind of new symptoms that emerge which require kind of medical help and support. And it's not really about learning the lessons of tinnitus or learning the
Right.
lessons of derealization. It's like,
Whatever the
okay,
message is, it's not stopping. And it's like,
yeah,
it's in my
but
ear,
it,
right?
yeah, but it is complicated, because it's certainly
Mm.
true that a lot of people say they do find it healing to kind of look at their experience as like a spiritual emergency or a kind of process, not just a breakdown. So it's, what I've taken so far from our research is there's no one size fits all, and you've got to be delicate and see what the person's, where they're at, what their frame is, what helps them. And it might, maybe they're into a kind of spiritual frame for it, maybe they're into much more of a kind of medical materialist frame for
Right.
it. um, People have different kinds of resources. Also, certain coping practices might work at sometimes and not others. Like meditation might be unhelpful to someone in a very dissociated state. At least, so, but perhaps a physical type of meditation might be helpful. And I wish it was clearer. I wish there was a clear one size fits all kind of intervention that we could identify and then test and then say, oh, you're experiencing difficulties, here you go.
Right.
But we have to, there are some patterns and clusters of coping mechanisms, but it's still, it's not one size fits all.
Yeah, I think, and just to build off of that point, which is that we really do want to rely on an evidence base. At the same time, all of this is quite new in our context, as well as there hasn't been a lot of research. And so clinicians, therapists, in the small role that we play in all of this, we're sort of the front lines in some ways. So the way that Fluence developed its training and the way that we teach, it comes from partly anecdotal experiences where, our team, where we learn from others who've been doing psychedelic integration work, and they're both re reporting, collecting these kinds of experiences, untoward experiences that people are having, and then also just noting what is helpful. It's
Yeah,
not, there's not a systematic recording of this, but it has to start somewhere. And so
yeah,
that's, again, just sort of giving credit to the therapist community who is just learning. Um,
yeah.
I'd like to shift gears, if that's okay, before we go to Q&A. This is a little bit of an experiment because we've been speaking quite a bit about, your work and your research and adverse events. Um, And so, but a lot of what I also appreciate about your writing is that outside of the challenging experiences project is that there is a connection to, or at least I see it there, kind of not quite so, perhaps social commentary, or there's sort of like it's more than just the clinical, right? And I know that you have a background in philosophy in your training. Prior to becoming a psychologist, I was studying philosophy. So again, very, very, very light. It's been decades since I've been in touch with it. But
Mhm.
in my clinical training in graduate school, actually, we had a class called History and Systems, which I appreciated quite a lot. It started with the ancient Greeks and really took us all the way to today, or maybe 10
Mhm.
years ago.
Mhm.
Um, and I think one of the premises that the professor was teaching, I think it was particularly in this context of, CBT versus psychodynamic therapy, which is maybe a kind of battle that is not so alive today. Maybe it is. Um, and his point, the professor's point was really, well, look, this is not new. I mean, it's sort of that classic idea. There's not that much new under the sun when it comes to ideas. And it's sort of in one way that this kind of battle, it's sort of a manifestation of a battle between romanticism and rationalism. Psychoanalysis, Freud, trauma, emotions, the unconscious, uh, instinct drives versus something like CBT, which is it's whether it's very it's like you could calculate whether it be behavioral
Mhm.
observations or uh, a calculative approach to cognition. And that's how we kind of understand how people are. And I would just love your take because now we're just sort of
Uh-huh.
just thinking
Yeah.
philosophically, or just what does psychedelics, we talk, what does that sort of represent? I mean, I have my thoughts on this, but I'm curious, how do you see this kind of its place in time?
Um, the way the sorting system I've used in a lot of my career was when I was a teenager, I read a book called The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche talks about these two forces, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And I go through different phases in my life. I was very Dionysian as a teenager. Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, transgression, leaping over limits, surrender, ecstasis, and so on. And then, Dionysus, it can be a bit rough as a god and you can get hurt. And then I got into Stoic philosophy and Socratic philosophy that's incredibly Apollinian, limits, reason, rationality, um, self-control. And I think, and I wrote my first book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. It was all about the Stoic and the Socratic. And the last chapter was, but there is, of course, the Dionysian as well. And then my second book was about the Dionysian, the ecstatic. And psychedelics, I would put within that kind of ecstatic system where you're turning off your self-control and opening up to the subconscious, to the body, to kind of collective ecstasy. And that can be, and both have their risks and their benefits. Like the rationalist Socratic tradition can be overly controlled and control freaky, and it can be kind of arid and cut off from the deeper sources of our being. And the Dionysian can be overly transgressive, overly wild and harmful, and just, there are all kinds of issues with the ecstatic. People can just become escapist, ecstasy addicts. They can go mad. And so I'm very interested. Now, this goes back to Aldous Huxley. He said, if you read Island, he talks about balancing the Socratic and the Dionysiac. How do we find that balance? In Island, he says, which did more for ancient Greek society, Plato or the Maenads? And then he's very much a both and thinker. So we need the Socratic and we need the Dionysiac. And right now I'm in much more of a kind of Socratic phase. So I just wrote a piece today criticizing a tradition called Dionysiac Gestalt, for being overly transgressive, unsafe, abusive, unethical. But there needs to be a Dionysiac element in culture. People need places where they can go to lose themselves, to surrender to something greater than themselves, to transgress as well. And the Dionysiac, it's always going to be somewhat risky and transgressive. So that is an eternal kind of dialectic.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And again, I feel like on many levels today, we need that to preserve that the both and the that tension there. And yeah, I'm very curious to see, I guess, not to have an overly American-centric perspective, but I am just having followed the resurgence of psychedelic interest in psychedelics, whether that be in research in medicine or amongst people who are embracing the dynastic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, um, in terms of partying or having fun or what have you.
Yeah.
And I think maybe if you asked us 10, 15 years ago how we would see this going, I'm just I'm curious to see how things evolve, because I think it's different than what we would have predicted.
Yeah.
Um, and the
Same
sort of
here. We
the
don't
concept
know.
of it, what's that?
Well, and we don't know how, I mean, I think this year is going to be fascinating. What kind of treatments, what kind of protocols get approval, what happens in different states in the US. Will psychedelic churches continue to grow? I mean, I am agnostic. I don't know. I have a thought about like how to build a better safety net, how to
Mm,
learn more about
mm,
risks and harm reduction, how to communicate the risks better, how to provide better support structures in place. So I'm very curious. Can I ask you a
yeah,
question?
sure.
What would you say would be like the kind of one or two priorities for a better like safety net for psychedelic culture, including the psychedelic industry?
Oh, I think I'd have to kind of separate those two out. I mean, one thing that I've thought of quite a bit around the industry slash medicine is the education of general practitioners, or sort of the people who are in the medical field who aren't necessarily therapists or mental health professionals. When one of my concerns is just around how they might make a recommendation for, say a patient comes in to their family doctor, they're depressed, and the practitioner might say, "Oh, I've heard that there's this new treatment, psilocybin for depression. I think you should check it out." Now, hopefully, right, there will be more safety nets where there's education of that patient when they encounter the provider who's going to be providing the psilocybin. But I would hope that maybe there's even some education before, right? That the general practitioner, the family doctor might say, well, I think you should maybe consider this option, but you should also know that this isn't, a one-hit solution. It doesn't quite work like antidepressants. It's not something that necessarily suppresses or numbs or kinds of gives you a sort of limited range of emotion, but in fact might like propel you. I mean, again, you'd want to. The language that I'm using is not maybe the most adept, but kind of sharing a little bit more information before they make a recommendation. I think that would be a really important safety net.
Yeah.
And I think we're also seeing some safety nets on the other kind of area. For example, the Fireside Project, and other, I think there are people who are recognizing that there's a need here for support.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And it's thinking through different bits of the ecosystem and maybe what needs to be in place in different bits of the ecosystem, not just within psychedelic culture, but outside psychedelic culture as well, like training and some literacy in psychedelics and psychedelic difficulties for emergency rooms, for psychiatrists and therapists, because the chances are if someone has difficulties after psychedelics, they might go to a therapist or a psychiatrist who's not familiar with them. We are in psychedelic land, which is this, where it's a small world, but the vast majority of people have no familiarity with psychedelics at all. So I've thought about that as one thing to be done. I've started kind of writing articles about psychedelic difficulties and what might help treat them for just general therapy trade magazines and things like that. So there's a whole process of societal education, which is going to take some time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe tempted I'm tempted to go back to the political and the societal, but one of my thoughts that I'm curious about is also what will happen when, if and when psychedelic therapy becomes available to people who are more on the conservative side of the political spectrum. I think there's some who had the idea that suddenly everyone's going to become a hippie. Uh, Not to speak poorly of hippies, but like that people's political and worldviews are going to shift and change. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. And I'm curious to see how psychedelic therapy and medicine is going to reverberate. I guess, again, speaking about the U.S. context, for again in a different culture than
Yeah.
I think that, again, if I were to, I don't have the stats on this, but I think the political and therefore value leanings of the psychedelic bubble you're speaking to is probably more on the left side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I think sometimes one sees this idea, like you sometimes see Rick Doblin suggesting that psychedelics will make us more liberal, more globalist. This has been a kind of dream in psychedelic culture for a long time, but it looks like psychedelics are amplifiers. If you're a conspiracy theorist and then take psychedelics, you're going to become even more of a conspiracy theorist, like, the QAnon shaman. If you're a libertarian transhumanist, and you take psychedelics, you will become even more of a libertarian transhumanist. So, I mean, that's not always the case, but it seems to be an amplifier. If you're a far right figure, there was a case of a guy who took mushrooms and then drove his van into a Muslim family in Canada. There was a court case recently. So it just amplified what was already in his mind.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's this research that has been kind of now almost part of the modern foundation of psychedelic research, which is this idea of openness and the big five, and that there's this shift in personality and um, openness to what, I think, is that question. And that it may not necessarily always be the things that we as the researchers or people who have experience with psychedelics might assume
Yeah.
was our priors. I'd like to maybe get a shift over just in the time remaining to some of the questions in the Q&A, and if anybody hasn't asked their question there, please to do so. One question here. So one, they appreciate your work and they ask, given the adverse settings that could be a predictor for challenging experiences, uh, did you find or ask or know of any kind of recommendations for a healthy or healing setting? I know there's a lot of interest in this question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's bizarre, but I don't think there's any research on this, Ingmar.
Mm,
I don't think there's any, we all know, we think we know that a certain setting is fundamental. But I don't think there's been any studies of this. Like, do people, take people in a windowless room and give them mushrooms? Do they have a worse experience than someone in a beautiful outdoor kind of, natural setting? Probably, but it hasn't actually been studied. But I think there you have to kind of rely on traditional trip law
yeah.
that, like it's nice if you're in a safe, setting, which has some kind of, connection to nature, and you're with people you trust. So I think maybe the ideal setting, if you're talking about psychedelic therapy, is with your existing therapist, because there's already a rapport and trust there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and then I would think, empowering the participant to make choices about their context. I'm amazed that they
Mm.
don't have a say in their playlist, for example. Everyone has to listen to Johns Hopkins playlist. Like, what if they're not into Barber's
Mhm.
Adagio for strings and so on? Like,
Mhm.
why can't we have some say? Like, when patients give birth in hospitals, they get to pick their playlist sometimes, if they're in a private hospital at least. So when people are so sensitive to cues, why can't they have some say?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this, there's more and more flexibility opening up around the playlist.
Oh yeah.
And there different trials have had different approaches to it. And of course there's also Mendel Kaelin and WavePath that's trying to sort of like for there to be constant kind of novelty in the sound.
Uh-huh.
The work of Ida Hartogson comes to mind a little bit when you're talking about set and setting, and so
Yeah.
some of the work around you spoke about the trip lore and just how the creation of um, sort of non-substance induced mystical experiences that have occurred due to a setting that kind of so
Right.
how would you say maybe made that more likely.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. Yes, I know Ardo Hartogson's book, and I've seen him present to the kind of the FDA on set and setting, but
Mm,
I'm not. I think that it would be fascinating for there to be more research on that. But you're right. There's also just the set and settings that make trance states more likely. That would be, probably involve things like ritual, authority figures,
mm.
I don't know, certain kind of lighting and so on. So there probably is some research on that. What kind of conditions make positive trance states more likely?
We had a question here about, I don't know if your research looked into this, but well, somebody asked, would being on an SSRI, and maybe I would even say having a history of SSRI use, be a risk factor for negative experiences specifically? I don't know if.
Um,
Um,
well, we didn't look at that. We did look. I mean, I think that if you have a pre-existing diagnosis or mental health issue, that makes challenges more likely. But that during the trip. But I one risk that I've come across, it's not something that we've studied or published on, so this is just anecdotal. But sometimes people are told to stop taking SSRIs
mhm,
or going to a retreat or before taking part in a trial,
yep.
and that can be done quite quickly, like in a month, without kind of support. And then after their experience, they have strange symptoms and they're thinking, is this the psychedelic or is this withdrawal from the SSRIs? So, you need to be careful about how quickly you taper off.
Yeah.
But in
And,
terms of taking psychedelics on SSRIs, I don't know. Do you know about?
well, there's sort of depends on the psychedelic and the interaction. It can blunt some effects. There's quite a lot to say here. I would say um, Kellen Thomas. We have I think a free webinar with him who speaks about the interactions between different prescribed medications and different psychedelics. It's quite informative. There's some, I think, still there's data, but how would you say, conflicting data around whether a history of SSRI use might dampen the benefit of MDMA's effect on treating PTSD. Again, it's not mixed data there. Um, the other thing, I really appreciated the point you mentioned about titrating people off of SSRIs. And one lesson that I've learned through my experience is to really not take that lightly. And yes, there's the withdrawal piece of it and not doing it too fast, but also something referred to as pause post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or even just for people who've been on SSRIs or antidepressants for decades, that for some, perhaps just it's possible that being off of SSRIs for some, it's just going to create these symptoms that we don't know if they can be addressed. And I certainly know, again, this is anecdotal, of individuals who, despite all of their best efforts, eventually just had to resume SSRIs because
Yeah,
I guess you could say that the brain has become, I want to say, dependent or habituated to what they do.
right. Yeah, right. I mean, a conversation I had this week, and someone said they were on SSRIs for since their kind of youth, since their childhood even, came off for a retreat, had a difficult experience, difficulties afterwards. And they felt there was a kind of pill shaming in
Mm.
psychedelic culture.
Mm.
Like, stay off the SSRIs. You've done the magic psychedelic dose now. But I that seems bizarre to me, to kind of stigmatize people for taking one chemical, but whilst praising them for taking in another. Whatever works, basically.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
I'm going to read a comment here. Sorry, because I'm also attending to you and to
yeah,
prepping for the next comment. I don't think this
yeah.
is really a question, but I think it's worthy of raising. Uh, in countries like Peru, where Aya and Wachuma are legal and the field hasn't been therapized, the responsibility for the consequences of the trip rests with the individual, good or bad. In life, we make life-changing decisions that have consequences. It can be bad or good. Having a child, for example. What is the difference in deciding to take psychedelics? Isn't the responsibility of people to know what can happen, whether it be good or bad? Not questioning that they need help, just thinking that people must do research, prepare very well, and not lie to themselves when deciding if they are ready. Um,
Yes, I think that is. I would like if public communication around psychedelics said, "Look, this is a risk. This can be a wonderful experience, but it can be terrifying. This isn't just 10 years of therapy in a night. This can be the beginning of a long, terrifying journey and not the end of it. So these have risks. So yes, as to whether and I think you're absolutely right. Who asked the question? People do have a responsibility to do their research. The industry and culture has a responsibility to communicate as well, so that when people do their research, they get accurate information about the risks. And then there will still be some people who experience difficulties. And so, yes, it's their responsibility, but what can help them in that, in terms of information, in terms of help, therapy, support. Um, so
yeah.
yeah,
I think what I would add to that is it sort of reminds me of the question or the point that I made about prescription or recommendations and the family doctors. Uh, I think Jules, you and I spoke earlier about prior to this webinar about spirituality, sort of magic and things that are unexplainable, and we maybe have a kind of agnostic perspective on it that we share. But I do see value in this concept of a calling, and I think sometimes that can be used to gatekeep, exclude people out from psychedelics. I think, in my opinion, it can also be taken too far. But the sort of wisdom in it, I believe, is that that's what this person is commenting on, is that when somebody the idea of a calling rather than having some external person recommending or prescribing is that sort of it's part of your empowered, or it's up to you to look into and understand as you engage in that the journey, so to speak.
yeah, yeah. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was a teenager, psychedelics were quite an edgy thing that risk-seeking seeker types did. And, and it was understood there were kind of risks to them. But you were teenagers and you're up for those risks and so on. And now they've just been framed as the kind of the solution to the mental health crisis. And so some of the people taking them are not, risk-seeking seeker types. They're ordinary Joes, they're kind of housewives or whatever, who just think, okay, this might help, fine. And they're not necessarily prepared for some kind of plunge into the abyss, or some kind of hell type experience, and then all the kind of stuff you got to deal with after that. Yeah. And yeah.
Well, I think I'm just noticing the time for us to wind down, but I think that was, again, well said. Before we wrap up, I'd like to maybe, and I conclude, maybe just passing it back to one more time to you, Jules. Is there anything that you maybe like to mention or speak to, or maybe promote if you, before we end?
Well, yes, I mean, my Substack is ecstaticintegration.org. Um, the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project has a website too. And we sometimes get emails from people in difficulties, and we try to connect them to, support and resources that might help them. Yeah.
Thank you. And what I would like to maybe end on just the note that I've been really appreciative of the work that you're doing both of these projects. And I think it's a really valuable contribution to the field. And I would really encourage all of our attendees, all of our listeners to really connect to the work that you're doing, also to empower us in doing a better job as clinicians.
Thank you, Ingmar. Thank you for everything you do for Fluence as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to connecting with you at our next webinar.